The rusted hinges screamed as Margaret Whitmore pushed open the front door of the Sutton plantation house. The sound cut through the Alabama afternoon like a blade, sending a murder of crows exploding from the rotting eaves above her head. She stepped across the threshold, her black morning dress catching on splinters of decaying wood, and immediately felt the weight of something watching her. The air inside hung thick and stagnant, filled with the smell of mold and something else, something sweet and cloying that made her stomach turn. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that managed to penetrate the boarded windows, and Margaret pulled her handkerchief to her nose as she surveyed the devastation before her. "Aunt Cordelia," she whispered to the emptiness. "What were you thinking, keeping this place?" The lawyer in Montgomery had been clear about the inheritance. Her aunt had died peacefully in her sleep at the boarding house in town, but she'd left Margaret this crumbling monument to the Old South, the Sutton plantation, abandoned since the end of the war a decade ago. Everyone said Cordelia Whitmore was the last person to set foot inside these walls, and that had been years ago when she'd first inherited it from some distant relative. Margaret's boots echoed against the warped floorboards as she moved deeper into the main hall. The staircase swept upward into shadows, its banister carved with elaborate flourishes that spoke of wealth built on human suffering. Portraits lined the walls, their subjects long since forgotten, their faces obscured by grime and water damage. But as she passed beneath them, Margaret could have sworn she felt eyes following her movement. Just nerves, she told herself, though her voice sounded small in the cavernous space. Nothing but an old house full of ghosts and regrets. She'd planned to make this visit quick, assess what could be salvaged, arrange for the rest to be torn down, and return to her life in Atlanta. The war had changed everything, and places like this were reminders of a world that needed to stay buried. But as she moved from room to room, Margaret began to notice things that shouldn't be there. In the dining room, the long table sat covered in dust thick as velvet, but there were disturbances in it, finger trails, as if someone had been tracing patterns across the surface. The kitchen held similar signs, cupboards with clean handle marks, a water pump that showed recent use, boot prints in the accumulated grime near the back door. "Hello?" Margaret called out, her voice stronger now. "Is someone here? This is private property." The silence that answered her felt heavy, expectant. But then, from somewhere deep within the walls, came a sound that made her blood run cold, whispers, too low to understand but unmistakably human. Margaret followed the sound through a narrow hallway lined with servants' quarters. The whispers seemed to move ahead of her, always just around the next corner, just beyond the next doorway. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pushed open door after door, finding only empty rooms filled with broken furniture and shattered dreams. But in the last room, she stopped. The space had once been a library, its shelves now empty save for a few moldering volumes. But what caught Margaret's attention was the portrait hanging above the fireplace, a family scene depicting what must have been the Suttons in their prime. A stern patriarch stood behind his seated wife, their 3 children arranged before them in perfect Victorian propriety. Margaret approached the painting, studying the faces that gazed back at her with unsettling intensity. The father's eyes seemed to follow her as she moved, and the youngest child, a girl no more than 10, wore an expression of such profound sadness that it made Margaret's chest tight with unexpected grief. "Poor things," she murmured. "Whatever became of you?" But as the words left her lips, Margaret could have sworn she saw the little girl's mouth twitch into something that might have been a smile. She blinked hard, shaking her head, but when she looked again, all the faces in the portrait seemed different somehow, their expressions more knowing, more alive. The whispers started again, louder now, and Margaret spun around to find their source. They seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, from the very bones of the house. Words she couldn't quite catch, voices that spoke of things that should stay hidden. Her hands trembling, Margaret backed toward the door, but something on the mantelpiece caught her eye. There, among the dust and debris, sat a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age but clearly more recent than anything else in the room. She snatched it up, her fingers shaking as she opened to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably her aunt's, the same careful script Margaret remembered from birthday cards and letters. But the date at the top of the page made her knees weak. 3 days ago. 3 days after Aunt Cordelia was supposed to have died. My dearest Margaret, the entry began. If you are reading this, then I have failed in my duty, and the burden now falls to you. The Suttons did not simply disappear when the war ended. Some things are too hungry to die, too rooted in sin to simply fade away. I have kept the secret for 40 years, fed the darkness that lives beneath this house, but I grow old and weak. It knows this. It waits for me to falter, to miss a feeding, to break the ancient compact that keeps it contained. I fear I have already waited too long. Margaret's hands shook as she read, her aunt's words painting a picture of madness and obsession. But as she turned the pages, finding entry after entry spanning decades, she began to understand that this was no delusion. Cordelia had been the guardian of something unspeakable, something that lived in the darkness beneath the Sutton house and demanded regular tribute. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Margaret realized they were no longer coming from the walls. They were coming from below her feet, rising up through the floorboards like smoke from a fire that would never burn itself out. She clutched the journal to her chest and ran for the front door, her morning dress billowing behind her like the wings of some great black bird. But as she reached the threshold, the door slammed shut with a sound like thunder, and Margaret found herself trapped inside with whatever had been waiting for her all along. The whispers became laughter, cold and ancient and hungry, and in the failing light that filtered through the boarded windows, Margaret saw the boot prints in the dust begin to multiply, as if an invisible army was marching through the house, welcoming her home. Have you ever walked into a place that felt like it was watching you back? What would you do if you found evidence someone had been living in your dead relative's abandoned house? Margaret pressed her back against the locked door, her breath coming in short gasps as the laughter faded into silence. The journal felt like a lifeline in her trembling hands, and she opened it again, desperate for answers that might explain what was happening to her. Her aunt's handwriting filled page after page, chronicling a horror that stretched back to the earliest days of the plantation. Margaret read by the dim light filtering through gaps in the boarded windows, each entry more disturbing than the last. The Suttons were not merely slaveholders, one passage read. They were practitioners of something far darker, convinced that the blood of their captives held mystical properties that could grant them power over life and death itself. They built their wealth not just on cotton and human misery, but on rituals that should never have been attempted by mortal men. Margaret turned the page with shaking fingers. The next entry was dated 20 years earlier, in her aunt's younger hand. I found the hidden chamber today, behind the false wall in the kitchen pantry. The smell that rose from below nearly made me retch, but I forced myself to descend. What I saw there will haunt me until my dying day. The Suttons had carved symbols into the living rock, symbols that hurt to look at directly. And in the deepest chamber, surrounded by the bones of the innocent, something waited in the darkness. It spoke to me in voices I recognized, the voices of those who died in torment, now twisted into something else entirely. A sound from the kitchen made Margaret's head snap up. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floorboards above her. She held her breath, listening to the rhythm of someone walking through the upper floors of the house. But that was impossible. The staircase she'd seen was too rotted to support anyone's weight. She forced herself to keep reading, needing to understand what her aunt had discovered in this place of horrors. The creature, for I can call it nothing else, made me an offer. It was starving, it said, weak from years of neglect after the Suttons fled at the war's end. But it remembered the old compact, the agreement made in blood and sealed with screaming. If I would feed it, tend to its needs as the Suttons once had, it would remain contained in the depths. If I refused, it would break free and visit upon the world horrors that would make the war's carnage seem like a child's game. Margaret's hands trembled as she turned to the next entry, dated just weeks after the first. I brought it what it asked for, a vagrant who would not be missed, a man whose life had already been destroyed by drink and despair. I told myself I was choosing the lesser evil, that one life weighed against thousands made the choice clear. But as I watched the creature feed, as I heard the man's screams echo through those awful chambers, I knew I had damned myself beyond any hope of redemption. The footsteps above grew louder, more insistent. Margaret looked up at the ceiling, watching dust rain down from between the boards. Someone was definitely up there, moving with purpose through rooms she'd thought were empty. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice cracking. "I know someone's in this house." The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been, pregnant with menace and watching eyes. Margaret clutched the journal tighter and continued reading, desperate to find some clue that might help her escape this nightmare. The years have blurred together, read an entry from a decade past. "I have become the thing I once despised, a keeper of horrors, a enabler of ancient evil. The creature has grown stronger with each feeding, more demanding. It no longer accepts the dregs of society. It wants innocence now, purity to corrupt and devour. I have resisted as long as I can, but my strength fails, and the whispers in the walls grow louder each day." A new sound reached Margaret's ears, a scraping, dragging noise that seemed to come from beneath the floor itself. Something was moving in the space below the house, something large and patient and hungry. The journal trembled in her hands as she read her aunt's final entries. "It knows I am dying. It can smell death on me like perfume, and it grows restless. The compact will not survive my passing unless another takes my place. I have tried to break the chains that bind it to this place, but the symbols carved in the rock run too deep, and the blood that was spilled to create them has soaked too thoroughly into the earth. Someone must take my place, or the world will learn what hungers in the dark places beneath Alabama soil." Margaret heard her aunt's voice as clearly as if the old woman were standing beside her. "I tried to spare you this burden, child. I tried to find another way. But blood calls to blood, and the Whitmores have always been bound to this place, whether we knew it or not." The scraping sound grew louder, more insistent, and Margaret realized it was moving toward the kitchen. Toward the pantry her aunt had mentioned, and the hidden entrance to whatever lay beneath the house. She clutched the journal to her chest and stood, her legs weak but her resolve strengthening. She had to see for herself what was down there. She had to understand what her aunt had been feeding all these years, and what it would do if she refused to take her place as its keeper. The kitchen lay in shadows, its ancient cookstove cold and rust-eaten. But Margaret could see the pantry clearly enough, a narrow closet lined with empty shelves. She approached it slowly, running her hands along the back wall until she found what she was looking for. A section of wood that felt different from the rest, newer somehow despite the decades of decay. She pressed against it, and with a grinding sound that spoke of hidden mechanisms and careful engineering, the false wall swung inward. Beyond lay darkness so complete it seemed solid, and from that darkness rose a smell that made her gag, rotten copper and something sweet that reminded her of overripe fruit. Steps had been carved into the living rock, descending into the earth at an angle that spoke of careful planning and deliberate excavation. Margaret fumbled in her reticule for the oil lamp she'd brought, lighting it with shaking fingers. The flame cast dancing shadows on the walls, revealing symbols that hurt to look at directly, twisted geometries that seemed to writhe and shift when she wasn't looking at them straight on. As she began her descent into the bowels of the earth, Margaret heard something that made her blood freeze in her veins. Singing. A child's voice, sweet and pure and utterly wrong in this place of darkness and despair. The voice was coming from below, from the deepest parts of the excavation. And as Margaret listened, she realized she recognized the tune, a lullaby her aunt used to sing to her when she was small, a song about going to sleep and never waking up. Sleep now, little one, sleep now and dream. The dark is so hungry, but Auntie's here to keep you safe. Margaret's lamp flickered, and in that moment of uncertain light, she could have sworn she saw a small figure at the bottom of the stairs, beckoning her down into the darkness with pale, reaching hands. Margaret's lamp flame steadied, but the small figure had vanished as if it had never been there at all. The lullaby continued to echo from the depths, growing stronger as she descended the stone steps. Each footfall brought her deeper into the earth, farther from any hope of easy escape, and closer to whatever waited in the darkness below. The symbols carved into the walls grew more elaborate as she went deeper, their twisted geometries making her eyes water when she tried to focus on them. Some appeared to be maps of constellations that didn't belong in any earthly sky, while others showed human figures in poses of agony or ecstasy. It was impossible to tell which. The rock itself seemed to weep moisture that glistened like tears in her lamplight. "Aunt Cordelia?" Margaret called softly, though she knew her aunt was dead. "What did you do down here?" The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence pressing against her eardrums. Margaret paused on the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs, but the need to understand drove her forward. Her aunt's journal had mentioned chambers, plural, and Margaret could see that the excavation branched off in multiple directions from what appeared to be a central hub. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, Margaret found herself in a circular room carved from solid bedrock. The walls were covered in more of the disturbing symbols, but these were different, older somehow, as if they'd been carved by different hands across centuries of use. The floor was stained dark with substances she didn't want to identify, and channels had been cut into the stone to direct flowing liquids toward a central drain. 3 passages led away from the main chamber, each marked with different symbols above their entrances. The leftmost bore the image of chains and shackles, the center showed a tree with roots that looked disturbingly like reaching arms, and the rightmost displayed what appeared to be a human heart pierced by thorns. Margaret chose the leftmost passage, following it as it curved away into darkness. Her lamp revealed more stains on the walls here, handprints and finger trails where desperate people had tried to claw their way to freedom. The passage opened into a larger chamber, and Margaret's light fell upon a sight that made her knees buckle. Dozens of skeletons hung from the walls, their wrists and ankles bound with chains that had been forged directly into the living rock. Some were small, children who had died in this place of horrors. Others were adults, their bones bearing the marks of violence that spoke of struggles that had lasted far too long. But what made Margaret's blood run cold was the arrangement. The skeletons had been positioned in ritualistic patterns, their bones inscribed with the same twisted symbols that covered the walls. Some had been partially disassembled, their remains redistributed to form geometric designs on the floor. And in the center of it all sat a chair carved from a single piece of black stone, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. Margaret approached the chair with trembling steps. Upon its seat lay another of her aunt's journals, this one older and more worn than the first. She picked it up with reverent hands, opening to a page marked with a strip of fabric torn from what looked like a child's dress. "I understand now why the Suttons chose this place," her aunt had written in a younger hand. "The limestone here is riddled with natural caves and passages that extend for miles in every direction. But this chamber was different even before they carved their additions. The symbols on the deepest walls predate any European settlement, they were here when the first explorers arrived, carved by hands that understood hungers older than recorded history." Margaret turned the page, reading by the flickering light of her oil lamp. "The creature told me the truth today, or as much truth as something like it is capable of speaking. The Suttons didn't create it, they found it, sleeping in the deepest parts of the cave system. It had been here for centuries, perhaps millennia, feeding on whatever the native peoples brought it in exchange for protection from other, worse things that stalked the darkness. The Suttons simply changed the nature of the compact, bringing it more substantial fare in exchange for knowledge of things that should remain unknown. A sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the chamber, the scrape of bone against stone, as if one of the skeletons was shifting position. Margaret looked up from the journal, her lamp casting wild shadows that made the hanging bones seem to sway and dance. "Hello?" she whispered. "Is someone there?" The scraping came again, closer this time, and Margaret realized it wasn't coming from the skeletons at all. It was coming from beneath the floor, from passages that delved even deeper into the earth. Something was moving down there, something large enough that its passage disturbed the stone itself. Margaret returned to the central chamber, determined to explore the other passages before whatever lurked below decided to make an appearance. The middle passage, marked with the root tree symbol, sloped downward at a steep angle. Her lamp revealed walls that had been carved more recently, their surfaces still bearing tool marks that spoke of desperate, hurried work. This passage opened into a chamber that made Margaret gasp in horror and recognition. The walls were lined with alcoves, each containing a body in various states of preservation. Some were merely bones, others still bore flesh despite the decades that had passed since their deaths. But what made Margaret's gorge rise was the care with which they had been arranged. These weren't victims, they were offerings. Each body had been positioned with reverent attention to detail, their hands folded across their chests, their eyes closed as if in peaceful sleep. Fresh flowers had been placed around them, and small offerings of food and drink sat in dishes beside each alcove. At the far end of the chamber stood a figure that made Margaret's heart stop. Her Aunt Cordelia, still in the grey dress she'd been buried in, stood with her back to Margaret as if admiring her handiwork. But something was wrong with her posture, with the way she held her head, as if invisible strings were supporting her from above. "Aunt Cordelia?" Margaret whispered, taking a step forward. The figure turned, and Margaret saw that her aunt's eyes had been removed, leaving empty sockets that wept tears of something dark and viscous. When Cordelia spoke, her voice was not her own, it was the sound of many voices speaking in unison, some young, some old, all of them touched by a despair that transcended death. "Margaret, child," her aunt's corpse said in those terrible voices. "You've come at last. We've been waiting for you, preparing a place among us. The hunger grows stronger each day, and it needs fresh blood to maintain the compact. Your blood, dear girl. Whitmore blood, freely given as ours was before you." Margaret backed away, her lamp flickering as her hands shook. "You're dead. I attended your funeral. This isn't real." The thing wearing her aunt's face smiled, revealing teeth that had been filed to points. "Death is just another doorway, child. We serve still, as you must serve. The creature below grows restless, and it has been far too long since the last proper feeding. You will take your place among us, and together we will tend to its needs until the end of time." The scraping sound came again, much louder now, and Margaret realized it was climbing toward them through passages she couldn't see. Whatever lived in the deepest parts of these caves was coming to meet its new servant, and from the sound it made as it moved, Margaret knew she didn't want to be here when it arrived. She turned and ran back toward the central chamber, her aunt's corpse calling after her in voices that belonged to all the dead who had gone before. "You cannot escape your heritage, Margaret. Blood calls to blood, and the compact must be maintained." But as Margaret reached the circular room, she found the way to the stairs blocked by more figures, dozens of them, all bearing the faces of people she didn't recognize but somehow knew. The Sutton family in their prime, standing guard over their ancient legacy with eyes like pools of black water. The scraping sound was directly beneath her feet now, and Margaret could feel the stone floor beginning to tremble with each impact of whatever was climbing toward her from the depths below. If you discovered your family had committed unspeakable acts and a demonic entity demanded you continue their legacy or die, what would you choose? Would you sacrifice yourself to break the cycle? The stone floor cracked beneath Margaret's feet as something massive shifted in the depths below. The figures of the Sutton family pressed closer, their dead eyes reflecting her lamplight like mirrors made of obsidian. Margaret clutched her aunt's journal to her chest, her back against the wall of the central chamber as the scraping grew louder and more insistent. "Please," she whispered to the advancing corpses. "I don't understand what you want from me." The patriarch of the Sutton family, a tall man with a beard that had once been white but was now stained with substances Margaret didn't want to identify, stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades spent in darkness. "Understanding comes with acceptance, child. Your aunt resisted at first, as you resist now. But the blood that flows in your veins has been pledged to this place since before your birth. The Whitmores and Suttons are bound by more than distant kinship, we are bound by the choices our ancestors made in the darkness below." Margaret opened her aunt's journal with trembling fingers, searching for some explanation that might help her understand what was happening. Her lamp cast dancing shadows on the pages as she read, and what she found there made her legs weak with horror. "The truth I could never bring myself to speak," her aunt had written in her final entry. Margaret's great-grandmother was not a Whitmore by birth. She was Patience Sutton, youngest daughter of the family, who fled this place when Sherman's army came through and took a new name to escape the shame of what her family had done. But blood remembers what history forgets, and the creature below knows its own. It has been calling to our line for generations, waiting for one of us to return and fulfill the compact that Patience broke when she ran. The journal slipped from Margaret's nerveless fingers as the full weight of the revelation crashed over her. She wasn't just an unwitting inheritor of her aunt's burden, she was a descendant of the very family that had created this horror in the first place. The Sutton blood that flowed in her veins had been pledged to the creature below before she was even born. "No," she breathed, shaking her head. "I won't be part of this. I won't continue what you started." The dead Sutton patriarch smiled, revealing teeth that had been carved with the same symbols that adorned the walls. "Choice is an illusion for those already claimed, child. But perhaps it would help you understand if you saw what your resistance would cost." The floor beneath Margaret's feet split with a sound like thunder, and from the crack rose a stench that made her gag, the smell of centuries of decay and corruption, of flesh that had been consumed by things that should not exist. The assembled dead stepped back as something began to emerge from the depths, climbing toward the surface on limbs that defied description. At first, Margaret could only make out fragments, a pale arm that bent in too many places, fingers that ended in claws worn smooth by decades of scraping against stone. But as more of the creature emerged, she began to understand the true scope of the horror that had been living beneath the Sutton plantation. It was not one thing but many, a writhing mass of human remains that had been fused together by forces beyond natural understanding. Dozens of faces stared out from its surface, their expressions frozen in the moment of their deaths. Some screamed silently, others wept tears that had turned to stone, and still others gazed at Margaret with a hunger that transcended physical need. "Behold," the Sutton patriarch said with reverence that bordered on worship, "the sum total of our family's legacy. Every soul that died in torment beneath this house, every innocent sacrifice to maintain our power, they have become part of something greater than they ever could have been in life." The creature's many mouths opened in unison, and when it spoke, Margaret recognized some of the voices, children who had vanished from nearby farms, travelers who had asked for shelter and never been seen again, and beneath it all, the sound of her aunt's voice, twisted by decades of complicity into something alien and wrong. "Margaret Whitmore," the creature said in its chorus of the damned. "Sweet child of my blood, welcome home. I have been so hungry, so terribly hungry, and your aunt's refusal to provide proper sustenance has left me weak. But you will change that, won't you? You will feed me as your family always has, and in return, I will share with you the secrets that lie beyond the veil of death." Margaret pressed herself against the wall, her mind reeling as she tried to process what she was seeing. "You're insane. All of you. I won't hurt innocent people to feed this abomination." The creature's laughter shook dust from the ceiling, and several of its faces turned toward her with expressions of mock sympathy. Innocent? Child, there are no innocent people. Every soul carries the weight of sin, the stain of choices that damn them as surely as any ritual sacrifice. We simply harvest what would be lost anyway, gathering the guilty and the forgotten to serve a purpose greater than their small, meaningless lives. One of the faces embedded in the creature's flesh caught Margaret's attention, a young girl, no more than 12, whose eyes still held a spark of awareness. The child's mouth moved silently, forming words that Margaret could barely make out. Help us. Please, help us. The sight of that pleading child filled Margaret with a rage that burned away her terror. These weren't willing servants of some dark god, they were victims, trapped in an existence worse than death by the greed and cruelty of her ancestors. And her aunt, whatever her intentions, had been complicit in maintaining their suffering. Let them go, Margaret said, her voice stronger now. Whatever compact my family made, I'm breaking it. These people deserve peace, not eternal torment. The Sutton patriarch shook his head sadly. You understand so little, child. They cannot be released, they are part of the creature now, essential to its existence. To free them would be to destroy it, and to destroy it would be to unleash something far worse upon the world. The creature is a guardian as much as it is a predator, holding back horrors that would make our small sins seem like virtues. The creature itself began to sink back into the crack in the floor, its many faces turned toward Margaret with expressions of disappointment and hunger. You will come to understand, dear child. I am patient, I have waited decades for your aunt to accept her role, and I can wait decades more for you. But hunger is a persistent thing, and eventually, you will choose between feeding me willingly and watching me feed myself on the innocent people of the world above. As the creature disappeared into the depths, the assembled dead began to fade as well, their forms becoming translucent and insubstantial. Only the Sutton patriarch remained, his pale eyes fixed on Margaret with an intensity that made her skin crawl. 3 days, he said simply. I will give you 3 days to consider your choice. Bring me a suitable offering, and I will teach you the rituals that will make your service bearable. Refuse, and I will climb to the surface and feed on whoever I find first. The blood of innocence will be on your hands, Margaret Whitmore, not mine. Margaret found herself alone in the circular chamber, her lamp burning low and the silence pressing against her like a physical weight. The crack in the floor had sealed itself, leaving no trace of what had emerged from below. But she could still feel the creature's presence, patient and hungry, waiting for her decision. She picked up her aunt's journal from where it had fallen, her hands shaking as she read the final entry once more. Cordelia had faced the same choice, and in the end, she had chosen to feed the monster rather than risk its unleashing upon the world. But Margaret wondered if there might be another option, one that her aunt had been too frightened or too complicit to consider. What if the creature could be destroyed? What if there was a way to break the cycle of feeding and sacrifice that had sustained it for so long? Her aunt's journals mentioned rituals and symbols, ancient knowledge that the Suttons had used to bind the creature to this place. If it could be bound, perhaps it could also be banished, or better yet, eliminated entirely. Margaret gathered up the journals and began her climb back to the surface, her mind already working on the problem. She had 3 days to find a solution, 3 days to uncover the secrets that might free the trapped souls below and end the nightmare that had consumed her family for generations. Behind her, in the depths of the earth, something laughed in voices she recognized, and the sound followed her all the way back to the world above. Margaret emerged from the hidden passage gasping for air, her lungs burning from the corrupt atmosphere below. The kitchen of the plantation house seemed almost welcoming compared to the horrors she had witnessed, but she knew her respite would be brief. 3 days. The creature had given her 3 days to make her choice, and already she could feel the weight of that deadline pressing down on her like a stone. She spread her aunt's journals across the kitchen table, searching for any mention of the rituals that bound the creature to this place. If the Suttons had found a way to contain it, perhaps she could find a way to destroy it entirely. The oil from her lamp cast flickering shadows across the pages as she read, each entry revealing new depths to her family's complicity in the horror below. The binding ritual requires 3 elements, she read from one of the older journals. The blood of the family line, freely given. A sacrifice of innocent life to seal the compact. And the recitation of words that predate human language, carved into the very stones by hands that knew the true names of hunger itself. Margaret turned the page, her heart racing as she found what appeared to be a diagram of the ritual chamber she had seen below. But this drawing showed additional details, passages that led deeper into the earth, to chambers she hadn't yet explored. And in the deepest part of the excavation, surrounded by symbols that hurt to look at directly, was something that made her breath catch in her throat. The heart of binding, the caption read. The source of the creature's power and the anchor that keeps it tethered to this plane of existence. Destroy the heart, and the binding fails. But beware, the heart is guarded by more than stone and shadow. It is defended by the accumulated guilt of every life sacrificed to maintain the compact, and approaching it means facing the weight of every sin committed in its name. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. If she could find and destroy this heart of binding, she might be able to free the trapped souls and end the creature's reign of terror. But the diagram showed that the heart lay in the deepest part of the cave system, beyond chambers filled with unknown horrors and guarded by the malevolent will of the creature itself. A sound from the front of the house made her look up, footsteps on the rotting porch, slow and deliberate. Margaret gathered the journals to her chest and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the boards. What she saw there made her blood run cold. A procession of figures was approaching the house, their forms translucent in the moonlight that had replaced the day's sun while she was below. Some wore the clothes of slaves, their bodies bearing the marks of whips and chains. Others were dressed as travelers or laborers, people who had come to the plantation seeking work or shelter and had never left. At the head of the procession walked a young girl in a torn white dress, her face bearing an expression of profound sadness. The child looked up at the window where Margaret was watching and mouthed a single word, "Help." Margaret's heart broke as she recognized the girl from the creature's flesh, one of the faces embedded in its writhing mass, one of the souls trapped in eternal torment. But how was she here, separate from the creature below? Margaret grabbed the most recent of her aunt's journals and flipped through it frantically, searching for an explanation. "The spirits grow restless as my strength fails," she found in an entry dated just weeks before Cordelia's death. "They appear to me now in dreams and waking visions, the souls of those fed to the creature over the decades. They beg for release, for an end to their suffering. But they also warn me of what will happen if I fail to maintain the compact. The creature's hunger has grown beyond what any single offering can satisfy. It wants to break free of its bonds, to roam the world above and feed on whoever it chooses." The procession of spirits had reached the front door, and Margaret could hear them whispering her name. But their voices carried no threat, only pleading, desperate hope that she might succeed where her aunt had failed. She made her way to the front hall, her bare feet silent on the rotting boards, and pressed her hand against the door. "I want to help you," she whispered. "Tell me how." The child's voice came through the wood, clear as crystal despite the decades that had passed since her death. "The heart beats in the deepest dark, where the old words were first spoken. But the way is guarded by our pain, by the memory of every moment we suffered before the end. You must be willing to feel what we felt, to carry the weight of our anguish if you hope to reach the heart and break the chains that bind us." Margaret pressed her forehead against the door, tears streaming down her Margaret pressed her forehead against the door, tears streaming down her cheeks as the weight of the child's words settled over her. "I'll bear it," she whispered. "Whatever pain you endured, I'll carry it if it means setting you free." The spirit's whispers grew softer, more grateful, and Margaret felt a strange warmth spread through her chest, the first comfort she had experienced since entering this cursed place. But even as the dead offered their fragile hope, she could feel something else stirring in the depths below. The creature was growing impatient, its hunger sharpening with each passing hour. Margaret returned to the kitchen and gathered supplies for her descent, oil for her lamp, matches, and a knife she found in one of the drawers. The blade was old but sharp, and she suspected she might need it for more than cutting rope or opening doors. The journal suggested that reaching the heart of binding would require a blood offering of her own, freely given to unlock the deepest chambers. As she prepared to return to the hidden passage, Margaret heard her aunt's voice again, not from any journal but echoing in her mind like a memory. The path to the heart leads through the chamber of echoes, where every scream ever uttered in these tunnels still reverberates. You must pass through that suffering to reach the binding stone, and it will try to break you with the weight of accumulated anguish. Margaret steeled herself and descended once more into the earth, her lamp casting dancing shadows on the symbol-carved walls. But this time, she didn't stop at the chambers she had already explored. Instead, she followed the diagram in her aunt's journal, taking passages that led ever deeper into the bedrock beneath the plantation. The air grew colder as she descended, and the whispers in the walls became more distinct. She could make out individual voices now, children calling for their mothers, men praying in languages she didn't recognize, women weeping for loved ones they would never see again. The weight of their collective suffering pressed against her mind like a physical force, but Margaret pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that she might be their only hope for peace. The passage opened into a vast chamber that took her breath away. The ceiling soared high above her head, disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of her lamp. But what filled the space below made Margaret's knees weak with horror and pity. Thousands of translucent figures filled the chamber, each one frozen in the moment of their death. They stood in silent witness to her passage, their eyes following her movement with expressions of desperate hope. Some reached out to her with incorporeal hands, their fingers passing through her flesh but leaving traces of cold that sank deep into her bones. "We remember," they whispered in unison, their voices creating an echo that seemed to go on forever. "We remember the pain, the fear, the moment when hope died in our hearts. Feel it with us, living child. Know what we knew, suffer what we suffered, and perhaps you will find the strength to do what we could not." Margaret walked among them, and with each step, their memories flooded into her mind. She felt the terror of a child torn from her family, the despair of a man who realized he would never see his home again, the agony of a woman who died knowing her children would grow up without her. The weight of their collective suffering threatened to crush her spirit, but Margaret held fast to her purpose. At the far end of the chamber, a narrow passage led to what her aunt's diagram labeled as the heart chamber. But as Margaret approached it, the temperature dropped even further, and her breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air. Something was moving in that passage, something that made the shadows writhe and dance without any source of light to cast them. Margaret stepped into the passage, and immediately felt the creature's presence pressing against her mind. It was closer here, more aware of her intentions, and its voice echoed from the walls around her with increasing urgency. "Turn back, child of my blood," it hissed in voices both familiar and alien. "You do not understand what you seek to destroy. The heart is not merely my anchor to this realm, it is a seal, a barrier that holds back things far worse than I. Break it, and you will unleash horrors that will make my hunger seem like mercy." Margaret pressed forward despite the creature's warnings, her lamp held high against the encroaching darkness. The passage walls here were covered in symbols that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them, and the air itself felt thick with malevolent presence. "You lie," she said to the darkness. "You're nothing but a parasite, feeding on suffering and fear. Whatever you're guarding against can't be worse than what you've become." The creature's laughter echoed from every surface, a sound like breaking glass and screaming children. "Can't it, dear child? Do you think I was the first thing the Suttons found in these caves? Do you think the native peoples built their seals to contain only me? I am the smallest horror in a hierarchy of hunger that stretches back to the dawn of time. Break the heart, and you will learn what true monsters look like. But even as the creature spoke, Margaret could hear other voices, the spirits she had seen in the Chamber of Echoes, their whispers growing stronger as she approached her goal. Don't listen, they pleaded. It lies to preserve itself. We have seen what lies beyond the heart, and it is not what the creature claims. Break the binding, and we will be free to pass on. The monster will lose its anchor, but no greater evil will be released. It is only fear that speaks such words. Margaret emerged from the passage into a circular chamber that made her gasp in awe and terror. The walls rose in a perfect dome overhead, their surface covered in symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. And in the center of the room, suspended in a column of pale blue flame that cast no heat, hung the heart of binding. It was beautiful and terrible, a crystalline structure the size of a human heart, its faceted surface reflecting images of every soul that had been sacrificed to create and maintain it. Margaret could see faces in its depths, thousands of them, all crying out silently for release. The child from the procession was there, along with countless others who had died to feed the creature's endless appetite. But standing between Margaret and the heart was a figure that made her scream in recognition and revulsion. Her Aunt Cordelia stood guard over the binding stone, but this was not the confused corpse Margaret had seen before. This was something wearing her aunt's form like an ill-fitting coat, its eyes burning with an intelligence that was ancient and utterly alien. "Hello, my dear," the thing said in Cordelia's voice. "I was wondering when you would find your way here. You've been so determined, so wonderfully stubborn. But this is where your journey ends. You cannot destroy the heart, I won't allow it." Margaret raised the knife she had brought, though she suspected it would be useless against whatever was inhabiting her aunt's corpse. "You're not Cordelia. She's dead." The creature smiled with her aunt's face, but the expression was wrong in ways that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Death is such a limited concept, don't you think? Your aunt serves me still, as you will serve me once you understand the futility of resistance. The heart cannot be destroyed by mortal hands, it requires a sacrifice of equal weight to what was used in its creation. And I think we both know what that would cost." Margaret looked at the heart again, and suddenly she understood what the creature meant. The binding stone had been created with the life force of thousands of victims, their souls trapped within its crystalline structure to power the rituals that contained the monster below. To destroy it would require a sacrifice of similar magnitude, not just her life, but her very soul, willingly given to shatter the bonds that held the dead in torment. "Yes," she whispered, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "I know what it would cost." The thing wearing her aunt's face stepped back, its confidence wavering for the first time. "You would damn yourself for the sake of strangers. You would trade an eternity of torment for their moment of release." Margaret thought of the child in the white dress, of the thousands of faces she had seen in the Chamber of Echoes, of all the innocent souls trapped in the creature's flesh. She thought of her aunt, who had spent 40 years feeding the monster rather than finding the courage to end the cycle of suffering. "Yes," Margaret said again, her voice stronger now. "I would." She raised the knife to her throat, and in that moment, the heart began to pulse with blinding light as it sensed her resolve. The blade felt cold against Margaret's throat, its edge sharp enough that the slightest pressure drew a thin line of blood. The heart of binding pulsed faster, its crystalline facets beginning to crack as it sensed her determination. The thing wearing her aunt's face let out a shriek that echoed through the chamber, its form beginning to waver as the power that sustained it flickered. "You don't understand what you're doing," it screamed, its voice now a mixture of Cordelia's familiar tones and something far more ancient and malevolent. "The binding requires balance, destroy the heart, and the accumulated darkness will have nowhere to go. It will consume you, transform you into something worse than what you seek to destroy." But Margaret could hear other voices now, rising from the heart itself. The trapped souls within the crystal were singing, a chorus of the dead that spoke of hope and freedom and the promise of peace beyond the veil. Their song gave her strength, drowning out the creature's threats with melodies of courage and sacrifice. She pressed the blade deeper, feeling her lifeblood begin to flow. But instead of weakening her, the act seemed to fill Margaret with power she had never known she possessed. Her blood struck the floor of the chamber and began to spread in patterns that matched the symbols carved into the walls, as if her very essence was part of some greater design she was only now beginning to understand. "Blood of the binding line," she whispered, remembering words from her aunt's journals. "Freely given to break what was made in bondage." The heart's light grew blinding, and cracks appeared across its surface like spider webs of luminous fire. The thing that had been her aunt stumbled backward, its form beginning to dissolve as the power that held it together unraveled. "Cordelia," Margaret called to whatever remained of her aunt within the creature's shell. "If any part of you is still in there, help me finish this." For a moment, the thing's face changed, and Margaret saw a flicker of the woman she remembered, tired, guilt-ridden, but still recognizably human. "Margaret," her aunt's voice came through the alien presence like sunlight through storm clouds. "I'm so sorry, child. I was too weak, too frightened to do what needed to be done. But you have the strength I never possessed." The creature fought against Cordelia's resurgent consciousness, but 40 years of suppressed guilt and self-loathing had given her aunt's spirit a power that even the ancient monster couldn't fully contain. "The heart," Cordelia gasped through the thing's distorting influence. "Strike it now, while my blood still flows in your veins." Margaret didn't hesitate. She pulled the blade across her palm, adding fresh blood to what already flowed from her throat, and hurled herself toward the suspended crystal. Her blood struck the heart's surface, and the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The crystal exploded in a nova of blinding light that filled every corner of the chamber. The symbols on the walls flared and died, their power broken by the destruction of the binding stone. And from the shattered fragments of the heart rose the souls of the dead, thousands of translucent figures ascending toward a light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the earthly realm. Margaret felt herself falling, her strength ebbing as her life force poured out onto the chamber floor. But she was not afraid. All around her, the freed spirits were singing songs of gratitude and joy, their voices creating harmonies that spoke of peace beyond any earthly understanding. The child in the white dress appeared beside her, no longer translucent but glowing with an inner light that made her beautiful beyond words. "Thank you," she whispered, her small hand touching Margaret's forehead with fingers that felt like warm sunlight. "We are free because of your courage. And you will not be alone in what comes next." Margaret could feel the creature's rage as it realized what she had done. The binding was broken, the heart destroyed, and the souls it had tormented for so long were beyond its reach forever. But she could also feel something else, a darkness rushing toward her, eager to fill the void left by the shattered crystal. The accumulated sin, she gasped, understanding flooding through her as her vision began to fade. "It has to go somewhere." The child nodded sadly. "You will carry it, as the heart carried it before. But only until the sun rises, only until the cleansing light can burn it away forever. Can you bear that burden for one night, Margaret Whitmore? Can you hold the darkness long enough for dawn to break its power?" Margaret thought of all the innocent souls ascending around her, their faces bright with freedom and hope. She thought of her aunt, finally released from the guilt that had consumed her for 4 decades. She thought of the child before her, and all the children who would never again fall prey to the hunger that had ruled this place for so long. "Yes," she whispered with her dying breath. "I can bear it." The darkness rushed into her like a tide of black water, carrying with it the weight of every sin committed in service to the creature below. Margaret felt herself changing, her flesh corrupting as the accumulated evil of generations flowed through her dying body. But she held fast to the memory of the singing souls, using their joy as an anchor against the storm of malevolence that threatened to sweep her away. The creature's final scream shook the chamber as it felt its anchor to the mortal realm severed. Without the heart to bind it to this place, it began to fade, its form becoming increasingly translucent as it lost the power to maintain its physical presence. "You have doomed us all," it hissed as it dissolved into nothingness. "Without guardians, without bindings, the greater horrors will sense the void and come to fill it. You think you have won, but you have only delayed the inevitable." But its words held no power now. The binding was broken, the heart destroyed, and the souls it had tormented were free. Margaret felt herself rising from her fallen body, her spirit sustained by the sacrifice she had made. She could see the sun beginning to rise through cracks in the earth above, its light streaming down into the chamber like spears of gold. Where the sunlight touched her corrupted flesh, it burst into flame that burned with no heat and consumed without destroying. The darkness she had absorbed began to dissipate like smoke, its power broken by the dawn she had managed to survive long enough to see. Margaret felt herself becoming translucent, her spirit preparing to follow the other souls into whatever realm awaited beyond the veil. But before she could go, she had one last task to complete. She gathered what remained of her strength and reached out to the cave system around her, feeling for the structural weaknesses in the limestone that supported the plantation house above. With a thought powered by her final act of will, Margaret brought the roof down. The ceiling collapsed with a sound like thunder, tons of stone and earth rushing down to fill the chambers where so much suffering had taken place. The hidden passages were sealed forever, the ritual chambers buried beneath an avalanche that would ensure no one could ever again use this place for dark purposes. As the dust settled and silence returned to the ruins, Margaret felt a presence beside her, her Aunt Cordelia, her spirit finally free of the corruption that had claimed it. "It's finished," Cordelia said, her voice filled with a peace Margaret had never heard in life. "The compact is broken, the dead are free, and the source of the evil is destroyed. You did what I could never find the courage to do." Margaret smiled as she felt herself growing lighter, more translucent. Above them, she could see the first rays of true sunlight beginning to penetrate the rubble, and in that light, she glimpsed the other spirits waiting to guide her to whatever lay beyond. "Are you ready?" the child in white asked, taking Margaret's hand in hers. Margaret looked back one last time at the ruins of the Sutton plantation, at the collapsed chambers where so much horror had been born and finally destroyed. Then she turned toward the light and let herself be led away from the darkness forever. 3 days later, Samuel Wright stood at the edge of what had once been the Sutton plantation, his weathered hands clutching a bouquet of wildflowers picked from the fields beyond. The house that had stood here for nearly 50 years was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble and charred timber that still smoldered in places despite the rain that had fallen the night before. The townspeople said it had been an earthquake that brought the old place down, but Samuel knew better. He had been born on this land 60 years ago, when it was still a working plantation and he was still someone's property. He had escaped during the chaos of the war's end, but he had never forgotten the sounds that came from beneath the big house in the dark hours before dawn, sounds that spoke of horrors no civilized mind should ever have to contemplate. "Miss Margaret," he said quietly, kneeling to place the flowers on the pile of rubble. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I wanted to thank you. Whatever you did here, it worked. The nightmares stopped 3 nights ago, the very night this place came down. For the first time in 60 years, I sleep without hearing the screams of the children who never came back from the big house." A gentle breeze stirred the flowers, carrying with it the scent of honeysuckle and new growth. Samuel smiled as he felt something he had thought lost forever, peace. The weight that had pressed on his shoulders since childhood, the constant fear that had followed him even into freedom, was finally gone. He wasn't the only one who felt the change. In the days following the plantation's collapse, other former slaves had begun arriving at the site, drawn by dreams and half-remembered promises of closure. They came from as far away as Georgia and Mississippi, old men and women who had carried the scars of this place for decades without fully understanding why. Martha Washington, now 73 and bent with age, had been among the first to arrive. She had worked in the big house as a child, cleaning and serving at the master's table, but she had always known there were parts of the house where children were not allowed to go. Parts where the screams came from. I dreamed about them, she told Samuel as they stood together among the ruins. All the ones who disappeared over the years, the children who went down into the cellar and never came back up. But in my dream, they were smiling. They were free, and they wanted us to know that the bad place was gone forever. Others came with similar stories, dreams of liberation, visions of children at peace, a sense that some ancient wrong had finally been set right. They held impromptu prayer services among the rubble, singing old spirituals that spoke of freedom and crossing over Jordan. The songs seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have, as if the land itself was joining in their celebration. Dr. Harrison from town arrived on the fourth day, drawn by reports of the unusual gathering. He was a practical man, a physician who believed in science and reason, but even he couldn't deny the change that had come over the area. The very air seemed lighter somehow, cleaner, as if a fog that had hung over the land for generations had finally lifted. Most curious thing, he told his wife that evening. That old plantation site has drawn nearly 50 colored folks from all over the state, and not a one of them seems to know exactly why they came. They just say they felt called to be there, to witness something important. And I'll be damned if I don't feel it too, like something that was wrong for a very long time has finally been set right. By the end of the week, the gathering had grown to include white folks as well, descendants of families who had lived in the area during the plantation's heyday, people who had grown up hearing whispered stories about the Sutton family and the strange disappearances that had plagued the county for decades. They came seeking answers to questions they had never dared to ask, and they found instead a peace they hadn't known they were looking for. Margaret's body was never found among the ruins, despite extensive searching by the sheriff and his deputies. Some said she must have escaped before the collapse, perhaps fleeing back to Atlanta when she realized the danger. But Samuel and the others who had experienced the dreams knew better. She had chosen to stay, to finish what needed to be finished, and in doing so had given them all the gift of closure. The land itself seemed to reflect the change that had taken place. Where once nothing would grow near the plantation house, wildflowers now sprouted among the rubble. The creek that ran through the property, which had been stagnant and foul-smelling for as long as anyone could remember, now ran clear and sweet. Children who had been afraid to play in the area now laughed and ran through the fields without fear. As the weeks passed and the crowds of pilgrims began to thin, Samuel established a routine of visiting the site every few days. He would bring fresh flowers and spend an hour or two sitting quietly among the ruins, feeling a peace he had never thought possible. Sometimes other former slaves joined him, sharing stories of their experiences on the plantation and finding healing in the telling. On one such visit, nearly a month after the collapse, Samuel discovered something that made his heart swell with gratitude. Growing from the exact center of the rubble pile was a single tree, a young oak that seemed far too large for its apparent age. Its leaves were a brilliant green that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight, and its branches provided shade that felt cool and welcoming even on the hottest days. "That wasn't there yesterday," Martha observed, joining Samuel beneath the tree's spreading canopy. "Trees don't grow that fast, not naturally." Samuel smiled and placed his hand on the tree's smooth bark, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer sun. "No," he agreed. "They don't. But then again, nothing about this place has been natural for a very long time. Maybe it's fitting that the healing should be just as miraculous as the horror that came before." As the years passed, the tree continued to grow at an impossible rate, its canopy expanding to cover the entire area where the plantation house had once stood. Visitors continued to come, drawn by stories of the peaceful feeling that pervaded the site and the dreams of liberation that seemed to visit anyone who spent the night nearby. Local ministers began holding services beneath the tree's branches, and soon it became known throughout the county as a place of healing and reconciliation. Former slaves and their descendants gathered there to share their stories, while white families came to acknowledge the sins of their ancestors and seek forgiveness for the part their families had played in the horrors of the past. Samuel lived to be nearly 90, and until the very end, he made his weekly pilgrimage to the tree. On his final visit, just days before his death, he sat in the shade of its massive branches and felt the presence of all those who had found peace because of Margaret Whitmore's sacrifice. "Thank you," he whispered to the wind that stirred the leaves above his head. "Thank you for setting us all free." When Samuel passed away peacefully in his sleep a few days later, his family buried him in the small cemetery that had grown up around the base of the tree. His grave was the first, but it wouldn't be the last. Others who had been touched by the plantation's dark history requested to be laid to rest there as well, finding comfort in the idea that they would spend eternity in a place where justice had finally been served. The tree continued to grow, its roots running deep into the earth where the chambers of horror had once been, transforming the very soil that had been tainted by generations of suffering. Where there had been darkness and despair, now there was light and hope. Where there had been the cries of the tormented, now there was only the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind and the songs of birds who nested safely in the tree's protective embrace. The Sutton plantation was gone forever, its legacy of evil buried beneath tons of stone and earth. But in its place had grown something beautiful, a living monument to the power of sacrifice and the possibility of redemption. Margaret Whitmore had given her life to break the chains that bound the innocent, and in doing so, she had transformed a place of horror into a sanctuary of peace. The blood remembers, but the land forgives. And in that forgiveness, all the lost souls finally found their way home. If this story stayed with you until the end, if you felt the weight of ancestral sin and the power of sacrifice, comment, "The blood remembers, but the land forgives."